You know, usually when we talk about being exhausted, there's a clear physical, mathematical reason for it. Like you ran a marathon, or you stayed up all night moving heavy furniture.
Right. Or you were out in the sun all day doing yard work.
Exactly. The math makes perfect sense in those scenarios. Energy out equals exhaustion in. It's a very straightforward transaction.
You spend the physical currency, and your body sends you the bill in the form of fatigue.
But then you look at what's happening to so many of us right now, and the math just completely breaks down.
Oh, 100%. It doesn't add up.
Because think about it. You sit at a desk. The temperature in the room is, a comfortable 70 degrees. You haven't lifted anything heavier than a ceramic coffee mug in the last 8 hours.
Yeah.
Yet at the end of the day, you are completely, utterly drained. Like your bones literally feel heavy.
Which is such a confusing feeling.
It really is. So welcome to today's deep dive. We're looking at a stack of sources today that unpack an incredibly relatable and frankly incredibly frustrating modern epidemic.
We're talking about severe mental fatigue.
Yeah, that phenomenon of brain fog. And why our own minds seem to be aggressively betraying us when we need them the most.
The materials we're synthesizing today offer this really fascinating and honestly deeply compassionate look at what's actually happening under the hood when we try and fail to focus.
Right. And our mission for this deep dive is to understand those hidden mechanisms causing the mental block, to look at the neuroscience behind your exhaustion, and more importantly, figure out how to gently guide your brain back to a healthy baseline.
Because it is a process to get back there.
It is. And when we say happening to you, I want to get hyper-specific here, because the sources lay out these symptoms that, well, they made me feel like someone had been secretly monitoring my life.
Oh, totally. It hits a little too close to home.
So tell me if this sounds familiar to you. You sit down to learn something new, and you feel compelled to watch every single video at 2x speed just to get through it.
Just to make it end.
Yeah, because the thought of sitting there for normal pacing is just agonizing. Or you open a book to study, and almost instantly, this overwhelming, suffocating sleepiness hits you.
It's crazy how fast it happens.
It feels like a physical weight just pressing down on your shoulders the second the cover opens.
It really is a visceral, almost narcotic level of fatigue, and it appears out of nowhere.
Or you're in the middle of speaking a sentence, and your train of thought just it derails completely, leaving you staring blankly.
Which is terrifying when it happens.
And you forget where you put your keys 60 seconds ago. And even the most basic low-stakes decisions like trying to figure out what to order for lunch.
Oh, that's the worst.
It feels utterly exhausting. It's terrifying because the immediate panic thought is, wait, am I getting dumber?
Right. Is my IQ actually dropping?
Exactly. Is this early onset cognitive decline? It feels like your brain is a smartphone with exactly 1% battery left, and just swiping to open the menu screen takes all of its remaining processing power.
Yeah, you touch one single app and the whole operating system just freezes.
It's the worst feeling.
That smartphone analogy really captures the reality of the situation perfectly. But we need to establish the most important takeaway from the very beginning of our analysis here. You are not getting dumber.
Thank goodness.
The source material is definitive on this. This is not a drop in your intelligence, and fundamentally, it's not even an issue with your baseline attention span or like a lack of discipline.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because if my brain feels like it's operating on dial-up internet, and I can't hold a thought for more than 10 seconds, but you're telling me my intelligence is fine, then what is actually crashing my system?
So we have to look at cognitive load and executive dysfunction. The crash really comes down to 3 hidden culprits.
Yeah.
Your mood, your routine, and a massive invisible mental burden that you're carrying around.
An invisible burden.
Right. Your inherent attention span is still fully intact. It is simply being buried under the crushing weight of psychological pressure.
So if we aren't losing our intelligence, we kind of have to follow the energy, right? Energy doesn't just vanish into the ether. It's being spent somewhere.
Exactly.
If I haven't done any physical or mental work, where is my battery draining? And the sources point to something completely psychological, which is emotional internal friction.
Yes. The root cause of your exhaustion isn't the work itself. The drain is the emotional state you are forced to navigate before you even start the work.
Before you even start.
Right. Your brain right now is operating in a constant state of high tension. The amygdala, which is the part of the brain responsible for threat detection, is hyperactive.
High tension, like a coiled spring that just never gets to release.
Exactly. Every single time you sit down and prepare to tackle a project, there is a secret underlying terror.
Terror, that's a strong word.
It is, but it's accurate. You might not even consciously register because you're so used to the feeling, but your nervous system is treating the upcoming task as a literal threat to your survival.
Oh, wow.
It is this profound subconscious fear of not doing well enough, a fear of falling behind. You start wondering, what if I can't do this as well as I used to? What if the outcome is mediocre?
What if I fail again?
Exactly.
Hold on, let's stop right there. Are you telling me that just worrying about failing consumes the same amount of actual physical energy as doing the heavy lifting of the work itself?
It frequently consumes more.
Wait, really? More?
Yes, this is the mechanism behind internal friction. Think of it like driving a car with the parking brake pulled all the way up.
Oh, that makes so much sense.
You're slamming on the gas pedal, that's your conscious mind trying to force yourself to be productive. But the brakes are grinding, the engine is overheating, and you're barely moving an inch.
Because they're fighting each other.
Exactly. The biological energy meant for your creativity, your analytical thinking, your focus, it's all being entirely drained, just fighting off these messy, terrified emotions in your subconscious.
Wow, that completely reframes the entire feeling of laziness.
Right, you aren't being lazy.
You aren't sitting there doing nothing. You are burning massive amounts of fuel just trying to overcome the emotional resistance to the task before you even engage with the first sentence of the actual work.
And our sources highlight this incredibly brutal paradox that this creates. Because you're anxious about the task, your rational mind tells you to calm down.
Yeah.
But because you have a looming deadline, your rational mind is also screaming at you to work. So you end up in this agonizing loop where you are trying to force yourself to relax while simultaneously forcing yourself to focus.
Forcing relaxation while forcing focus. That is a literal tug of war inside the prefrontal cortex. It sounds like you're ordering your brain to walk north and south at the exact same time.
Which naturally tears the system apart.
Yeah.
This is the definitive answer to the mystery of why you feel so unbelievably tired when you haven't actually done anything productive.
Yeah, your baseline energy is just depleted by the internal conflict.
Exactly. You're running a massive invisible background program of anxiety, and it's eating up all your available working memory.
So we have this exhausted, tapped out brain. The battery is critically low, flashing red. And that leads us straight into understanding how a desperate brain tries to cope with an absolute lack of energy.
Right.
Which brings us to the screens.
Oh, the inevitable trap of the modern coping mechanism.
The sources describe a scenario that is universally frustrating. Like, you fight through all that internal friction we just talked about, you force the parking brake down, you finally manage to get into a flow state.
A rare victory.
Right, you're actually doing the thing, but then a minor obstacle appears. A difficult sentence, a complex math problem. Almost instantly, that emotional friction flares back up.
The panic returns.
Exactly. The messy emotions hijack the wheel, and before you even consciously realize your hand has moved, you're reaching for your phone. Or you open up a new browser tab for social media.
Because your brain hits a wall of discomfort, and because it lacks the energy reserves to push through that discomfort, it immediately looks for an escape hatch.
And what blows my mind is how time works in this state. Have you ever noticed the bizarre time dilation?
Oh, absolutely.
When you're trying to learn something dense, trying to maintain focus, 5 minutes feels like 2 torturous hours. You look at the clock, convinced half the day has passed, and it's been 6 minutes.
It's agonizing.
But the second you start scrolling on your phone, 2 hours vanish in what feels like 5 minutes. Time flies when you are supposedly resting, but crawls when you're learning.
So that time distortion is entirely driven by cognitive load. When you're studying under stress, your brain is actively monitoring its own performance. That meta-awareness checking to see if you're doing a good job creates a massive cognitive load. You are hyper-aware of every passing second.
So that's why it drags on.
Right. But when you switch to scrolling, you enter a state of passive consumption. You shut down that self-monitoring network entirely, which causes you to lose all track of time.
Reaching for social media when you're in this specific state of exhaustion is it's like drinking salt water when you're stranded in the desert and completely dehydrated.
That's a great analogy.
It feels like a relief for a split second. It feels like exactly what you need to quench the thirst, but it introduces something toxic into your system that actually makes the underlying dehydration so much worse.
And the neurology backs up that saltwater analogy perfectly.
Yeah.
Your brain is starved. It's drained from the internal friction. So the primitive parts of the brain take over and desperately demand an instant hit of dopamine for emotional regulation.
Just a quick fix?
Exactly. It wants a reward without the effort.
Yeah.
The prefrontal cortex, the part of you that enforces discipline and long-term planning, is simply too exhausted to intervene.
And our phones are basically frictionless dopamine vending machines.
They really are.
Yeah.
Apps, games, short-form video feeds, they're engineered to provide an instant, low-effort dopamine spike.
Yeah.
And once your brain gets a taste of that cheap, easy dopamine, it makes it infinitely harder to return to a task that requires patience and sustained effort.
Because the contrast is just too sharp.
Right. Why would your brain willingly go back to the grinding, terrifying work of writing an essay when it could just swipe up with a thumb to receive another hit of pleasure?
It wouldn't. It will always choose the path of least resistance when its battery is that low.
Always.
But that path leads directly into a swamp. The source material points out what happens next, and it's really the darkest part of the cycle. The guilt spiral.
The guilt is where the real damage is done.
You're scrolling, and a rational voice in the back of your head is begging you to stop. You feel this immense, crushing guilt. You feel profound regret over wasting the afternoon.
You're actively angry at yourself.
Yes, and yet you just keep scrolling. You find yourself entirely unable to put the phone down, even though you aren't even enjoying the content anymore. You're just swiping with dead eyes.
Yeah.
Why can't we just stop if we know it's making us miserable?
Because the guilt itself is a stressor.
Oh.
The guilt adds a massive spike of negative emotion, which increases the internal friction, which drains even more energy.
It's making you more exhausted.
Exactly. And to cope with this new, higher level of stress, your primitive brain demands more cheap dopamine. You are using the source of your anxiety to soothe your anxiety. It is a perfect, self-sustaining, vicious circle.
Wow. So this is the landscape we are dealing with. We know the symptoms, the severe brain fog and mental fatigue.
Right.
We know the root cause, this intense internal friction driven by a subconscious fear of failure. And we know the trap, the endless cycle of cheap dopamine and crippling guilt.
It sounds pretty bleak when we lay out the mechanics like that.
It can feel totally hopeless when you're caught in the middle of it, which is why we really need to talk about the antidote.
Yes.
How do we actually break this cycle? Because historically, my strategy, and I think the strategy of most people listening, has just been to aggressively yell at myself to try harder.
Oh, the classic white knuckle approach.
To white knuckle it, to drink 3 cups of coffee and force my brain into submission.
Which is the absolute worst strategy you could possibly deploy.
The worst.
The worst. Yelling at yourself just signals to your amygdala that there is an internal threat. It creates more fear, more internal friction. It adds more weight to the mental burden you're already failing to carry.
Okay, but if I can't force it, what is the alternative?
The very first step, the absolute prerequisite for any of this to work, requires a fundamental shift in mindset. The source text is incredibly clear on this point. You must stop being so hard on yourself.
Okay.
You have to intentionally, deliberately lower your standards.
Lower my standards. Okay, I need to push back on this.
Go for it.
If I have a massive project due for work or a huge board exam coming up, am I supposed to just accept failure? Just tell my boss or my professor, sorry, I'm lowering my standards today. Here is some mediocre work. Doesn't lowering the bar just guarantee I'm going to produce garbage?
So you aren't lowering the standard of the final product. You are lowering the threshold for action.
Ah, threshold for action.
Right. Your priority right now in this state of exhaustion is not a massive creative breakthrough. You're not going to sit down and write 20 brilliant pages in one go. If you demand that of yourself, the threat detection system in your brain will panic and shut you down.
Because it sees the mountain and gives up.
Exactly. Your only priority right now is restoring your baseline energy and clearing the brain fog.
So how do we clear the fog while still moving toward the deadline? How does lowering the bar actually help me cross it?
By breaking the barrier to entry into micro steps, you stop demanding hours of deep focus from a brain that is running on 1% battery. Instead, you aim absurdly, almost comically low.
Like how low?
You bypass the amygdala's threat response entirely. Your goal isn't to study for 3 hours. Your goal is simply to sit down quietly at your desk.
And the source says, if even that feels too heavy, aim lower.
Just open the book. Don't even promise yourself you will read a single word. Just place the open book on the desk. If you can do that without panicking, then aim to read exactly 1 paragraph. If you're writing a report, tell yourself you only have to write 2 sentences and then you have permission to stop.
That makes an incredible amount of sense neurologically because if my goal is write a brilliant essay, my brain perceives a massive mountain. The internal friction spikes.
Right.
But if my goal is write 2 mediocre sentences, my brain looks at that and says, okay, that's not a threat. We can survive that.
You are sneaking past your own anxiety. You're removing the heavy emotional stakes from the action. Once you write those 2 sentences, you overcome static friction. The physics of momentum take over.
And kinetic friction is much easier to overcome.
Exactly. You'll likely find yourself writing a 3rd sentence and then a 4th because the fear of starting is gone.
There's a physical component to this antidote too, which is fascinating.
Oh, yes.
The sources outline very specific physical resets to pull you out of the fog. It says that after every 30 minutes of work, even if that work was just reading a few pages, you must stand up and physically move your body.
The physical state is deeply tied to the mental state. We forget that the brain is a biological organ that relies on blood flow.
Yeah. The text explicitly notes that staying still for too long makes your brain sluggish, which feels so true in practice. Like, if I sit in one position, locked in a chair for 3 hours, my mind literally feels like it's turning into wet cement.
Because you're accumulating metabolic waste in the brain when you are highly focused. Standing up, walking around, stretching it, increases cardiac output. It literally flushes fresh blood and oxygen into the brain, clearing out that waste.
So the instruction is to get up, go to a balcony or a window if you have one, breathe some actual fresh air. And this detail is my absolute favorite. Look at something far away. Look at the horizon or a distant building.
That is a crucial biological hack. We spend all day looking at screens that are 12 inches from our faces.
It's like we're trapped in a tiny visual box all day. How does looking far away break the tension?
Well, when you focus on something close to your face for a long time, your eyes are physically straining, and your nervous system interprets that narrow visual field as a state of alertness or sympathetic arousal.
Oh, like you're tracking a predator or a threat.
Exactly. When you expand your visual field and look at the horizon, it relaxes the ciliary muscles in your eyes. This sends a direct signal to your parasympathetic nervous system that you are in a safe, open environment.
That's amazing.
It physically turns off the stress response.
A biological off switch for anxiety. But what about when we want to take a real break? Because we've established that picking up the phone for a quick dopamine hit just drains us more in the long run.
Right. This brings up a critical reevaluation of how we define rest. We have to completely redefine our breaks. A break needs to be actual restorative rest, not just a different type of cognitive load.
Right.
The source recommends setting a strict, specific time limit for your phone. You don't have to ban it entirely. That's unrealistic. But you cannot let it be the default activity the second you stop working.
So if I'm on a break and I'm not scrolling social media, what am I actually supposed to be doing?
You go for a walk without a podcast.
Yeah.
You listen to some instrumental music while staring at the ceiling. You fold laundry.
Oh, just boring stuff.
You engage in activities that don't demand active, complex cognitive processing or rapid emotional reactions.
Sure.
You have to let your brain actually go quiet.
Go quiet.
Yeah.
That sounds like a luxury we don't have time for, but based on everything we've discussed, it's actually a biological necessity.
It is the only way the battery actually recharges. If you're feeding your brain social media during a break, you aren't resting. You're just running different, highly demanding apps in the background. The screen never actually goes dark.
That makes perfect sense to bring all these pieces together. We have the micro steps to lower the action threshold and sneak past our own anxiety.
Yes.
We have the physical resets every 30 minutes to increase blood flow and signal safety to our nervous system. And we have true quiet breaks instead of doom scrolling to actually recharge the battery. It is a really solid, achievable framework.
And it is entirely based on working with your biology instead of fighting it.
But the most comforting part of these sources, to me at least, is the grace they offer the reader.
Oh, absolutely.
The text explicitly warns against perfectionism, it says. You don't have to implement all these steps at once.
Please do not try to do them all at once. If you turn this advice into a massive, rigid checklist, that just becomes another impossible standard to fail at.
Right.
It will trigger the exact same internal friction we're trying to cure.
Oh no, I failed at my anti-failure routine. No, you just pick 1 or 2 easy concepts. Maybe just start with looking at the horizon every half hour. Start there.
Exactly.
And even when you implement these steps, the reality is you might still get distracted. You might still open a book and feel incredibly sleepy today.
And that is a normal part of the healing process.
It doesn't mean you're broken, and it doesn't mean you're failing.
If we can leave you with one core understanding from this entire deep dive, It is this. Your focus has not disappeared. Your intelligence has not evaporated. It is not gone forever.
No. It's just a little weak right now. It is bruised.
It's recovering from a marathon of invisible anxiety.
As long as you don't give up on yourself, and as long as you don't resort to aggressively punishing yourself for simply being human, that focus will slowly find its way back to you.
Yeah.
The key to all of this, the micro steps, the walks, the lowering of the action threshold, is self-reconciliation. It is calling a truce with your own mind.
Calling a truce. I love that phrasing because for so long it feels like we've been treating our brains like the enemy, like this stubborn, defective machine we have to just whip into compliance.
When really it is just an exhausted, terrified organ asking for a minute to breathe.
As we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave you with something to chew on, something that builds on everything we've uncovered today about that 1% battery, the neuroscience of dopamine, and the exhaustion of simply worrying about work. Let's hear it.
We've established that our brains treat the mere fear of a task as an exhausting physical threat, draining our energy before we even type the first word. We know how much effort it takes to fight that, so. What would happen if we started treating our quiet time, our true, phone-free, completely unproductive rest, with the exact same level of fierce commitment and protective energy that we normally reserve for our work? What if the ultimate productivity hack isn't about figuring out how to push harder, but about mastering the profound courage to temporarily do absolutely nothing?